What if truth is a flame choosing the quiet-hearted, shaping their lives softly while the world rushes past without seeing? Good evening, dear friends. Wherever you are listening, may this moment feel like a warm circle of shared peace. Settle in, subscribe, and let us begin together in gentle quiet. Tonight we follow Saint Dominic, whose noble beginnings blossomed into a mission of mercy, preaching and luminous faith, as visions, miracles, and tireless compassion shaped a spiritual legacy that still guides souls seeking truth in every age with gentle light. From the quiet glow of that opening candle, the story flows gently into the earliest hours of Saint Dominic's life, as though his arrival were a soft dawn rising over the hills of Castile. He was born in the small village of Caleruega, a place of stone houses, wheat fields, and a silence broken mostly by the bells of the local church. People there lived close to the land and close to each other, carrying their faith not as an idea, but as breath, woven into the rhythm of daily life. Into this world Dominic entered, the third child of Felix de Guzman and Blessed Joan of Aza, a couple noble in lineage but humbler still in spirit. Those who remembered them described a home where generosity came as naturally as breathing, where the poor found a place at the table, and where prayers rose like gentle incense at the close of each day. It was said that mercy lived in the very walls of that home, and that the children learned kindness long before letters or numbers. Joan, his mother, often paused in her days to watch the landscape beyond her window. She felt the world twice as deeply as most, and she carried her children in her heart even before they were born. While expecting Dominic, she prayed more often, not out of fear, but out of a quiet sense that this child would walk a path unlike the others. One night, unable to sleep, she dreamed a dream that would shape how she saw him forever. She saw a dog, white and black, leaping from her womb with a torch in its mouth, running across the earth to set it aflame, not with destruction, but with a cleansing fire that drove away darkness. When she awoke, she held the image as something both mysterious and tender. A mother may not know the future, but she can sense when a child's life carries a weight beyond its years. Some said she told the dream only once. Others believed she whispered it in moments of prayer, asking God to guide her son gently, whatever that dream might mean. Dominic, in his first years, showed a temperament that matched neither pride nor restlessness. He grew quietly, drawn to the soft rhythms of life around him. He loved the gentle murmur of Scripture read aloud at dusk, the sound of wind brushing the wheat, the small acts of mercy his parents offered to neighbors in need. Even as a boy, he seemed to listen not only with his ears, but with his whole soul. When people spoke, he paused long enough to understand them. When someone suffered, he felt the tug inside his heart before he understood why. His mother would sometimes touch his cheek and whisper that he saw the world differently, though he never quite knew what she meant. Perhaps what she sensed was that his eyes lingered on every person as though searching for the spark of God within them. As Dominic grew older, he was known for a kind of childlike seriousness, not the heaviness of worry, but a natural inclination toward thoughtfulness. He delighted in watching candle flames, fascinated by how a small light could push back so much shadow. He would sit at the threshold of the house in the late afternoons and watch the sky turn gold, asking quiet questions about why beauty seemed to lead the heart toward God. These were not the kinds of questions most children asked, but Dominic was not most children. His curiosity had the weight of wonder, and wonder is often the first language of holiness. When he was sent to study under the local clergy, he absorbed knowledge with a reverence that surprised his tutors. Reading was not simply learning for him, it was a doorway. Scripture stirred something deep in him, as though each passage were a thread, pulling him gently toward a purpose he did not yet see. Those who taught him noticed that he prayed even when no one asked him to, and that he prayed not to be admired, but because he felt at home in silence. Some boys long for adventure, for noise, for acclaim. Dominic longed for understanding, for truth that healed the heart rather than sharpened the tongue. Perhaps that is why the villagers would catch him offering small kindnesses without fanfare, helping the elderly walk, sharing what he had without hesitation, or comforting those who felt alone. Mercy was not something he practiced, it was simply who he was. In those quiet early years, the prophetic dream of his mother occasionally returned to her mind. Sometimes she saw the image of that dog with the flaming torch and wondered if it meant danger or mission, loss or blessing. But whenever she looked at her son, she felt peace wash over her. She saw in him no violence, no fire of destruction. Rather, she saw a flame of compassion that grew brighter as he aged. She came to believe that the dream had not been a warning but a promise, that the truth he would carry would be a light for many. As childhood gave way to adolescence, Dominic's inner life deepened. He developed a habit of slipping into the village church late in the evenings, where the cool stone walls held the day's warmth and the candles flickered like small stars. He would kneel for long stretches with a stillness unusual for one so young. Some nights he prayed for guidance. Other nights he prayed simply to be near God. Over time, prayer shaped him more deeply than any lesson from books. It gave him a presence that felt rooted, calm, and quietly radiant. People began to sense that being near Dominic made their burdens feel lighter, though they could never explain why. Yet for all his contemplative spirit, Dominic was not withdrawn from the world. He enjoyed simple joys, walking through vineyards, listening to stories from older villagers, watching his brothers laugh and play. But even in these moments, he was attentive. He carried every joy and sorrow he witnessed like a small treasure in his heart. There was a tenderness in him that made others open their lives to him, even when he was still only a boy. Those early years in Caleruega were not marked by dramatic events or miracles. Rather, they were shaped by the quiet forming of a soul made ready for God's work. It is often in the gentle places that great missions find their first breath, and the fields and chapels of his childhood became the soil where grace planted seeds unseen by the world. Seeds of compassion, seeds of truth, seeds of a calling that would one day lead him far beyond the village's borders. But for now, he remained the son of Felix and Joan, a boy with a listening heart and a future wrapped in mystery. The villagers could not know how far his steps would eventually travel, nor how many lives would change because of the truths he carried. They could see only the young boy walking through wheat fields with the evening sun on his shoulders, unaware that heaven watched him with quiet expectancy. And so, the first chapter of his life rests like a morning stillness, offering only hints of the fire that would one day burn brightly through him. But every journey begins with a whisper, and every flame begins with a spark. What quiet turning would next shape the boy into the man God was preparing him to be? From the soft stillness of his childhood years, the story of Dominic moves gently into the season when his mind began to open like a book, each page revealing a new depth of purpose. As he grew into youth, his parents recognized a hunger in him that could not be satisfied by the rhythms of village life alone. There was an inward leaning, a pull toward learning, toward the mystery of God's truth. And so, with hearts full of hope, they sent him to the cathedral school at Palencia, a respected center of study where young men shaped their minds in the ways of scripture, theology, and classical wisdom. It was a journey that would draw him into silence as much as scholarship, forming the foundation of the mission that awaited him. The road to Palencia was long, stretching across fields and winding paths, but Dominic seemed undisturbed by the distance. He walked with an easy steadiness, carrying only what he needed and nothing more. Those who traveled with him later recalled how he moved with a calm that seemed older than his years, as though he already understood that the external journey was merely a shadow of a deeper, interior pilgrimage. When he arrived in the city, he found it bustling with the noise of markets, merchants, and students. It was a world far larger than Calaruega, filled with voices and arguments and debates that echoed through narrow streets. Yet even in that lively environment, Dominic sought out quiet corners, places where he could breathe and reflect. His heart had been trained in the stillness of his village, and even amidst crowds, he carried that silence like a small sanctuary within. At the school, Dominic devoted himself wholeheartedly to study. Scripture captivated him, not for its academic challenge, but for its living presence. He approached each lesson as though God were whispering directly through the words, inviting him deeper into friendship. His teachers noted that he read not only with his eyes, but with reverence, letting the meaning rest in his heart before attempting to speak about it. Theology, too, stirred something within him. He longed to understand how God moved in the world, how grace touched the soul, and how truth could guide human life like a lantern guiding travelers home. But Dominic did not confine himself to theological studies alone. He explored the arts, philosophy, and the liberal disciplines, believing that the mind, like the soul, should be nourished broadly to serve God wisely. Books were precious in those days, copied by hand and treasured. Dominic handled them with tenderness, as one might handle relics. He spent long hours reading by candlelight, the warm glow illuminating his quiet concentration. His classmates admired his discipline, but were perhaps even more struck by his humility. He did not boast of his knowledge, nor did he seek attention. Instead, he shared insights gently, offering them as gifts rather than declarations. Despite his love of study, what distinguished Dominic most during these years was the sincerity of his compassion. Palencia, like many cities of its time, faced seasons of hardship, harsh winters, failed harvests, illness spreading among the poor. During one particularly devastating famine, hunger swept through the region with a cruelty that left families desperate. Students at the cathedral school often remained insulated, protected by the support of benefactors. But Dominic could not ignore what he saw in the streets. Children with hollow eyes, mothers too weak to stand, elderly men trembling as they begged for a crust of bread. He began by giving what he had, small portions of his own meals, bits of clothing, coins that his parents had provided for his studies. Yet even as he offered these things, he felt it was not enough. One evening, returning from a walk through the city, he passed a woman sitting on the cold stone steps of a church. She was wrapped in tattered cloth, holding an infant who no longer cried from hunger. Her eyes met his for only a moment, but in that moment something in Dominic broke open. He walked back to his lodgings in silence, turned the key in his small trunk, and began gathering his belongings: clothes, blankets, treasured books. The next morning, he sold everything he owned, all the books he had painstakingly collected, even the manuscripts he loved most. When people asked him why, he answered simply, "I could not bear to be surrounded by dead parchments while people die of hunger." It was a sentence that echoed through Palencia, stirring hearts with its quiet conviction. Yet even after he had sold everything, Dominic did not become empty. Rather, he became more himself. He discovered that poverty, when freely chosen for love, made the soul lighter, freer, more able to receive the grace of God. He began to understand that knowledge alone could not heal the world. Knowledge needed compassion as its companion, otherwise it hardened into pride. This understanding slowly shaped his prayer life as well. In the small chapel near his lodgings, he spent long hours kneeling before the tabernacle, listening with the same attentiveness he had shown since childhood. Sometimes he prayed silently, but often he simply remained in stillness, letting the presence of God rest upon him. The Eucharist became his anchor, his nourishment, his source of strength. He understood even then that the love he poured into the world was not his own, but the love he first received from the body of Christ. As he matured, those around him began to see qualities that set him apart: steadfastness, clarity of judgment, an unusual ability to comfort others, and a patience that seemed to come from a deeper well. When fellow students struggled with discouragement, they sought Dominic, knowing he would listen without judgment. When disputes broke out, his calm presence often dissolved the tension. One teacher observed that he seemed to draw people toward God simply by being himself. Yet for all this, Dominic never sought recognition. He moved quietly, preferring to blend among his peers rather than stand above them. His humility grew in tandem with his learning, shaping him into a scholar whose heart remained as soft as the fields of his childhood. During his years in Palencia, Dominic encountered another kind of poverty of spirit, of hope, of faith. Some students carried wounds from their families, some doubted God's presence amid suffering, some succumbed to the temptations of pride or cynicism. Dominic's response to each was the same: mercy. He spoke gently, offering reminders that God's love was wider than any despair. He prayed for them as earnestly as he prayed for the hungry in the streets. In these quiet acts, a deeper truth was forming within him, that God had not fashioned him merely to gather knowledge, but to give himself away. One might imagine that a young man who gave away everything would face discouragement or insecurity, yet Dominic did not falter. Instead, he walked lighter. He often reflected on how God had provided for him, even in his simplest moments, through friendship, through study, through prayer. He carried an interior trust that gave him peace. This trust was not naive, but luminous, born of a life already intertwined with grace. What others called sacrifice, he experienced as freedom. His years of study shaped him profoundly, carving out in him a spacious heart ready to be filled with a greater calling. He had learned the depth of Scripture, the discipline of study, the necessity of prayer, and the transforming power of compassion. Yet something in him sensed that all this preparation was only the beginning. God had been shaping him quietly, like a sculptor working in soft light, revealing the contours of a mission that would one day stretch across nations. As he neared the end of his studies, Dominic found himself wondering what shape his life would take. Would he teach? Would he serve in a parish? Would he retreat into monastic quiet? Or was there some path not yet visible? These questions did not trouble him. Rather, they drew him into deeper reliance on God. He walked along the riverbank one evening, the sky tinged with the soft colors of dusk, and felt the quiet certainty that God would guide him, step by gentle step. The exact destination remained hidden, but the direction was clear. He was being prepared to carry truth into a world yearning for light. Thus, the season of study became not a conclusion, but a doorway. Dominic emerged from Palencia not simply as a scholar, but as a young man whose compassion had been sharpened into purpose, whose prayer had become a refuge, and whose heart was ready to walk wherever God might send him. Yet he did not know that the next chapter would bring an encounter so startling, so piercing, that it would mark the true beginning of his mission. And so we leave him here, standing at the threshold of young adulthood, the wind stirring his cloak, his soul listening for the whisper that would shape everything to come. From the gentle threshold of his student years, the journey now turns toward the moment when compassion, once a quiet movement in Dominic's heart, would awaken into something fierce and unmistakable. As he left Palencia with his bishop, Diego de Acebo, he stepped into a wider world, one filled with its own beauty yet shadowed by the sorrows of a fractured age. Traveling with a seasoned bishop was a new experience for Dominic. It meant long days on uneven roads, meeting strangers in unfamiliar towns, hearing the heartbeat of a world beyond study halls and chapels. And though he did not know it, these travels would place him directly in the path of the encounter that would mark the true turning point of his life. The journey began peacefully enough. The small caravan wound through valleys and hills, stopping in quiet villages where children played barefoot near wells and elders leaned on wooden canes to watch the travelers pass. Dominic observed everything: The way people greeted each other, the hunger that flickered behind polite smiles, the simple faith carried in gestures far more eloquent than words. He slept in inns when available, and under the stars when the road demanded it, praying softly before sleep with the same devotion he had carried since boyhood. To most, these were ordinary days, but for Dominic, each encounter, each story overheard, each glimpse of human struggle whispered something deeper. He had spent years studying truth. Now he was learning how truth lived among people, messy, wounded, searching, and his heart, shaped by mercy, absorbed every detail. One evening, they approached a town strained under the weight of poverty. The streets were quiet, not with peace, but with emptiness. A famine had swept through the region months earlier, and though some had begun to recover, others were left clinging to survival. Dominic's face grew solemn as he walked, sensing the heaviness in the air. He paused at the sight of shuttered windows and doorways where no lamps glowed. Hunger does not always show itself through cries. Sometimes it is the silence that reveals it. Bishop Diego had business with local clergy, leaving Dominic with a few hours to move through the town on his own. He walked slowly, carrying nothing that marked him as more important than the people around him. A few children watched him from a distance, curious but wary. An elderly man sat hunched against a wall, too weak for begging. Dominic knelt beside him, offering the small piece of bread he had saved from their meal. The old man looked up with eyes dim yet grateful, whispering a blessing before Dominic rose and continued onward. It was then, in this quiet, struggling place, that Dominic encountered the woman who would forever alter the direction of his life. He turned down a narrow alley where the shadows stretched long against the dirt. At first, he saw nothing unusual, but then, faintly, he heard a muffled sob. Following the sound, he found a woman standing near a weathered doorway, her shawl pulled tightly around her thin shoulders. She was young, yet life's hardships had already carved exhaustion into her face. When she looked at Dominic, it was not with fear, but with a pain so deep it seemed she had already surrendered to despair. Dominic greeted her gently, as he always did. He asked whether she needed help. She hesitated, her eyes welling with tears, as though caught between the instinct to hide her suffering and the desperate need to be seen. At last she confessed the truth in a voice barely above a whisper. She had no food, no money, and no family left to care for her. Her hunger was so severe that she had turned to the only source of survival left to her, selling her own dignity in order to live. The words struck Dominic with the force of a blade, not because he judged her, but because he saw the fullness of her suffering in that single confession. This was not sin born of malice. It was desperation shaped by hunger. He felt his breath grow unsteady, not from anger, but from compassion so intense it ached. In that moment, Dominic understood something profoundly. Poverty was not simply a lack of possessions. It was an assault on the soul, a shadow that could drive even the pure-hearted into choices they never imagined. He felt his knees weaken, and without thinking, he knelt before the woman on the dusty ground, a gesture so startling she stepped back in confusion. But Dominic remained there, his voice steady as he told her she had dignity that no suffering could erase, that God had not forgotten her, and that she would not face this darkness alone. He reached for the small purse he carried. It was not much, just enough to provide food and shelter for a few days. Yet he pressed it into her hands with the same reverence he had once given to books, as though he were offering something sacred. But even that was not enough. Dominic rose and went searching through the town, seeking anyone who could help her find work, shelter, and a path away from the despair that had nearly consumed her. He spoke with merchants, with widows willing to offer lodging, with clergy who could arrange assistance. He moved swiftly, with a quiet intensity that surprised those who met him. By evening he had secured help for her, modest but enough to restore hope. When he returned to her, she stared at him in disbelief, unable to fathom why a stranger would go to such lengths for her. Dominic answered with a simplicity that carried the truth of his whole life. "You are loved by God." The woman began to cry, not from sorrow but relief. She had been seen, not as a sinner, not as a problem, but as a child of God worth rescuing. And Dominic, for his part, felt something shift inside him. It was as though the encounter had struck a bell deep within his soul, awakening a resonance that had always been there, waiting. When he rejoined Bishop Diego that night, he was quieter than usual. The bishop asked nothing. He simply sensed that the young man beside him had been touched by a moment of grace that needed no explanation. Dominic prayed long into the night, reflecting on what he had witnessed. He realized that compassion, when lived fully, demanded more than generosity. It demanded presence. It demanded entering the suffering of others, standing beside them, and refusing to let darkness have the final word. That night, something deepened within him, an understanding that truth was not simply a matter of doctrine, but of love, lived out in the most wounded corners of the world. The next morning, the town looked no different. The famine had not lifted. Hunger still lingered. But Dominic had changed. He carried in his heart the weight of the woman's suffering and the clarity that God was calling him toward a mission, greater than study or comfort. He sensed that this encounter had not been accidental. It had been a doorway into his vocation. He did not yet know where that vocation would lead. He only knew that the world was crying out for truth, spoken with mercy, for love offered without judgment, and for the kind of hope that could lift even the most burdened soul. As they left the town and traveled onward, Dominic looked back once, whispering a prayer for the woman and for all those trapped in the webs of poverty and despair. He felt the wind brush against his face, a soft reminder of the presence of God, who often speaks through the smallest movements. And he carried forward the question that would guide the rest of his life. How could he bring the light of truth to a world so deeply in need of healing? From the quiet ache of that encounter, the journey turns toward the landscape that would soon reveal to Dominic how deeply the world longed for truth, spoken with mercy. The woman he had rescued remained etched in his heart, not as a wound, but as a revelation. Her suffering had shown him that human souls did not fall into despair out of stubbornness, but out of hunger, hunger for hope, hunger for love, hunger for God. As he and Bishop Diego continued their travels, Dominic found himself more attentive than ever, listening not only to words, but to the silence beneath them. That silence often carried a heaviness he had not noticed before, one that lingered in marketplaces, in parishes, in conversations whispered behind half-closed doors. The heaviness came from confusion, from uncertainty, from the spiritual disorientation that had begun to spread across regions of southern France and beyond. It was here, against this backdrop, that Dominic first glimpsed the wounded world he would one day dedicate his life to healing. Their route eventually led them toward Toulouse, a city of learning and commerce, where ideas flowed as freely as goods along the river. Dominic had heard that the region was troubled by spiritual division, but nothing prepared him for the subtle yet pervasive unrest he encountered. At first glance, life in Toulouse appeared vibrant, merchants calling out their wares, university students debating in clusters, families gathered at fountains. Yet beneath the surface he sensed a tension, small hesitations in people's voices, wary glances exchanged among neighbors, a faint shadow that lingered even in moments of laughter. The city's spiritual heart seemed unsettled, as though something essential had slipped out of alignment. It was Bishop Diego who spoke openly of the situation. Over a simple meal, he explained that the region had become a stronghold of the Albigensian movement, a form of dualist heresy that had taken root with surprising speed. It taught that the material world was evil, that the body was a prison, that Christ had not truly become flesh, and that salvation required rejecting nearly everything that made life human. Many of its followers, sincere but misled, lived with a harsh austerity that starved both body and soul. They believed they were walking the path of purity, yet they walked it with fear rather than hope. Dominic listened quietly, absorbing every word. He did not respond with anger or condemnation. What he felt was sorrow, deep, genuine sorrow, for people who sought truth but had found only distortion, for souls who longed for holiness but had been handed shadows disguised as light. In the days that followed, Dominic began speaking with the people of the region, approaching them not as a judge, but as a companion. He found that the Albigensians were often far more zealous and disciplined than many Catholics. Their preachers traveled on foot, embraced poverty, and lived simply, traits that drew admiration from a population weary of corruption and excess among certain clergy. Dominic understood immediately that no argument, no harsh rebuke would win hearts in such an environment. Truth needed to be carried with humility, compassion, and example. He realized that the Church's response had too often relied on authority rather than witness, and that souls wounded by confusion required not force, but clarity offered with love. One afternoon, as he walked through the city, Dominic encountered a gathering of people listening to an Albigensian preacher. The man spoke passionately, painting the world as a battleground between light and darkness, spirit and flesh, good and evil. His words carried a certain appeal. They seemed logical, disciplined, uncompromising. Yet Dominic could hear the hollowness beneath them, a kind of despair wrapped in piety. When the crowd dispersed, Dominic approached the preacher with respect. Their conversation lasted for hours, stretching from late afternoon into the dimming light of evening. Dominic listened first, truly listened, before gently offering the truth of the Incarnation, the astounding reality that God Himself had entered the world not to condemn matter, but to redeem it. His words were not sharp, but steady, not confrontational, but confident in the love of Christ. The preacher, surprised by the young cleric's calm conviction, confessed that he had never heard the Catholic faith presented with such sincerity and depth. Dominic did not boast or gloat. He simply invited him to consider that the God who created the world had called it good, and that the flesh Christ took on was sacred, not shameful. The conversation did not end in immediate conversion, but it planted a seed, one that Dominic knew would grow only through patience and prayer. As days turned into weeks, Dominic and Bishop Diego traveled deeper into the region, meeting people of every station: peasants, nobles, merchants, students, mothers, widows, each carrying their own mixture of hope and confusion. Dominic discovered that heresy had woven itself into the fabric of daily life, not because people sought rebellion, but because they yearned for spiritual authenticity. Many felt abandoned by leaders who lived in comfort, while their flocks struggled to survive. Others were simply searching for meaning in a world that often felt harsh and unpredictable. Dominic's heart broke for them, but his sorrow sharpened into resolve. He sensed that God was inviting him into something greater than mere observation. He was being called to respond, to offer truth not as a weapon, but as a balm. One evening, while resting at a small inn, Dominic reflected on all he had seen. He sat by a small window where moonlight spilled across the wooden table, casting soft shadows that reminded him of the mystery of the Incarnation, light entering darkness gently, without force. He felt a stirring within, something like the movement of a quiet flame long sheltered beneath the surface of his life. He knew now with growing certainty that compassion alone was not enough. Compassion must lead to action, to a life given wholly to the service of truth. Yet he also understood that truth required humility. He could not preach with authority if he lived in greater comfort than those he wished to reach. He could not speak of Christ's poverty if he himself refused to embrace simplicity, and he could not ask people to trust him if his own life did not reflect the gospel he proclaimed. In that moment, Dominic felt the weight of his calling settle upon him, not as a burden, but as a profound invitation. The next morning, he told Bishop Diego of his resolution. He wished to combat heresy not through argument alone, but through the witness of a life lived in poverty, in fraternity, in relentless charity. His mission would be to preach the truth with the same simplicity Christ had shown his disciples. Diego listened carefully, and though he knew the road ahead would be difficult, he recognized the unmistakable signs of God's guidance. He placed a hand on Dominic's shoulder and blessed him, giving his support with the same quiet confidence that had guided him throughout their travels. From that day forward, Dominic walked with new purpose. He spoke with the earnestness of someone who loved both truth and people equally. He traveled lightly, refusing comforts that might create distance between him and those he sought to serve. And he prayed, sometimes through the night, sometimes with tears, asking God to guide his voice and strengthen his compassion. Yet amidst all this, a question lingered in his heart like a soft echo. If truth must be carried with humility, what form would that humility take in the years ahead? How would God shape the next steps of the mission already beginning to unfold? From the quiet certainty that had begun to settle over his soul, Dominic stepped gently into a new season of life, one in which the mission that had once seemed distant now unfolded with a kind of solemn clarity. He had seen suffering, confusion, and spiritual hunger. He had listened to voices both misled and sincere. He had recognized that truth could not be restored through force or argument alone, but only through a witness shaped by humility and love. And now, as he and Bishop Diego continued their journey through lands troubled by the Albigensian movement, Dominic began to see with unmistakable sharpness the task God was entrusting to him. It was not merely to preach, but to become a living sign of what authentic Christian life could look like in a world yearning for light. Their travels took them through valleys dotted with stone villages and across hills where shepherds tended flocks, with patience learned from the land itself. As they walked, Dominic absorbed everything with the contemplative attention that had marked him since childhood. He noticed how families gathered around simple meals, how children clung to their mothers' skirts, how laborers returned home weary but faithful. These were the people caught in the storm of spiritual confusion. Ordinary souls searching for meaning, longing for direction, often unsure whom to trust. Dominic felt their yearning like a quiet ache in his chest. The more he listened to their fears and questions, the more clearly he understood that heresy did not spread because people were rebellious or malicious, but because they were unshepherded. They needed someone to walk beside them, to speak truth with tenderness, to remind them that God had not abandoned them to the harshness of the world. In village after village, Dominic encountered Albigensian preachers who lived outwardly austere lives. Their poverty and discipline impressed the townspeople, often more than the lives of local clergy who had grown accustomed to comfort. Dominic understood immediately that the Church's response must match, even surpass, the sincerity and simplicity of these preachers. The gospel needed to be made visible again, not merely spoken of. And so, he resolved to model the life Christ himself lived, a life of poverty, humility, and relentless compassion. He would walk on foot. He would refuse wealth. He would speak gently, pray fervently, and live in such a way that people could see God's truth reflected in his presence long before they heard it in his words. His first opportunity to put this conviction into action came sooner than expected. As Bishop Diego engaged in discussions with regional leaders about addressing the spread of heresy, Dominic began visiting small communities on the outskirts of major towns. In one such place, he found a family deeply torn by division. The father, attracted by the Albigensian ideal of rigorous spiritual purity, had joined their community, believing it offered the holiness he longed for. His wife and children, however, remained within the church and were confused and heartbroken by his departure. When Dominic arrived, he did not begin with lectures or condemnations. Instead, he sat with them in their modest home, asking questions, listening to their fears, and comforting them with the quiet assurance of God's abiding presence. When the father returned later that evening, tense and uncertain, Dominic welcomed him with the same warmth he had shown the rest of the family. Their conversation lasted long into the night, filled with pauses, sighs, and moments of silence more powerful than speech. Dominic spoke of Christ becoming flesh, not as a deception but as an act of love. He spoke of the goodness of creation, the dignity of family, the beauty of hope. Slowly, the man's defenses softened. It was not an immediate conversion, but by dawn, something had shifted. He agreed to return to the church, not out of fear, but because Dominic had shown him a God who embraced rather than condemned. This moment was small in the eyes of the world, but for Dominic, it was a sign. Truth, when carried with love, could rebuild what had been broken, and so he continued, village by village, conversation by conversation, always walking, always praying. His nights were marked by long vigils, often in cold chapels where the single flame of a candle illuminated the stone altar. He would kneel there until his knees ached, whispering prayers for those he had met that day, lifting their sorrows to God with the tenderness of one who felt the weight of each soul as a treasure entrusted to his care. The more he traveled, the more clearly he saw the wider landscape of confusion that stretched before him. Heresy was not simply a theological error. It had become a culture, a way of interpreting reality that shaped how people saw themselves and God. Dominic recognized that transforming this culture would require more than occasional visits from passing clergy. It would require a long-term presence. Preachers who lived among the people, who embraced poverty, who studied deeply, and who communicated truth through word and example. He did not yet conceive of the order of preachers, but the seeds were already stirring within him. One afternoon, as he walked through a dusty road lined with olive trees, Dominic found himself reflecting on the life of Christ. Jesus had traveled on foot, depended on the hospitality of others, preached in fields and homes, and reached out to those neglected by society. Dominic felt a quiet certainty that this must be his own way as well. He could not fight confusion from a distance. He must walk into it, barefoot if necessary, carrying only the love of God as his guide. His prayer during these days grew deeper, more intense. Often he prayed not for strength, but for wisdom. He asked God to help him speak in ways that hearts could receive, to help him see beyond appearances, to help him remain gentle even in the face of hostility. There were moments when he felt overwhelmed by the enormity of the task. He was only one man, and the world was wide. How could he possibly reach everyone who needed the light of truth? But each time doubt crept in, he remembered the woman in the famine-stricken town, the family reconciled after division, the countless individuals who had listened to him with tears in their eyes. God did not ask him to save the world. God asked him to love the world one soul at a time. One evening, at an inn along their route, Dominic and Bishop Diego discussed the growing crisis. The bishop spoke of counsels, strategies, and the need for ecclesial action. Dominic listened respectfully, but when he finally spoke, his words were simple. Let us preach like the apostles, walking, praying, living among the people. Diego paused, then nodded slowly. He understood. This was not idealism, but a return to the heart of the gospel. And so it was decided. They would begin their mission not from palaces or councils, but from the road, from the dust, from the places where people lived their most ordinary struggles. Dominic felt a warmth rise in his heart, a quiet confirmation that he was walking the path God intended for him. The confusion he had witnessed would not be dispelled overnight, but God would work through his willingness, his humility, and his persistent love. The next morning, as they set out again, the sun rising gently over the horizon, Dominic whispered a prayer that would echo throughout his ministry. "Lord, make me an instrument of your truth. Let me speak only what brings souls to you." And in that prayer, he felt the steadying presence of grace, an assurance that he was not walking alone. Yet even as he embraced this calling, another question began to form quietly within him, one he would revisit many times in the years ahead. If truth could only be carried with humility, what shape of life would sustain that humility? How would God draw him even deeper into the simplicity required to restore wounded hearts? From the quiet resolve that had begun shaping his steps, Dominic felt himself gently entering a new chapter, one where the call to preach no longer fluttered like a distant echo, but resonated as a steady interior summons. The road he walked with Bishop Diego stretched onward through hills and valleys, through towns softened by sunlight and others shadowed by suspicion. Yet with each mile, Dominic sensed more clearly that God was preparing him for a mission, requiring not only learning and compassion, but a deep surrender of his entire life. The question forming quietly in his heart, how would God shape the humility needed for such a task, began to find its first answers in the rhythm of prayer that immersed him with each passing day. Dominic's nights became the tender ground where this calling deepened. Often he arrived at an unfamiliar church near dusk, asked permission to remain after the doors were closed, and then kept vigil until dawn. Some nights he knelt in silence, simply listening to the stillness. Other nights he wept for souls strained by heresy, imagining the fear and confusion in their hearts. Sometimes he walked the aisles barefoot, praying aloud in a gentle whisper that echoed faintly against stone walls. With every vigil, he felt his heart widen, as though God were slowly expanding his capacity to love those he had not yet met. He prayed especially for those who felt abandoned by the church, for those seeking holiness in distorted ways, for those whose hunger for God had led them into spiritual danger without their knowing. He prayed for clarity, for patience, for the grace to speak truth with tenderness, never with pride. These long hours, held in candlelight and silence, gradually shaped him more profoundly than any book or debate could. During the days, Dominic continued walking and preaching, sometimes alone, sometimes with Bishop Diego. He learned that people listened not first to arguments, but to presence. When he arrived in a village, he did not begin by preaching. He sat among the people. He offered to help with small tasks. He shared simple meals with farmers and listened to their stories. Only after he had become a friend did he begin to speak of God's mercy. This approach, so rooted in love, surprised many who had come to expect harsh condemnation from religious leaders. Dominic offered no such harshness. He believed deeply that truth spoken without love wounded more than it healed, and that restoring the church's credibility required a gentleness mirroring Christ himself. There were days when the mission felt encouraging. A woman would return joyfully to the sacraments. A young man would turn away from the rigid coldness of dualist teachings. A family long divided by spiritual disagreement would find unity through Dominic's calm presence. But there were also days when the work felt heavy. Some people met him with suspicion, believing he came only to judge. Others were so steeped in the Albigensian worldview that dialogue seemed impossible. Dominic never responded with frustration. Instead, he prayed more fervently. Each obstacle only deepened his trust in God's ability to guide him. It was during one of these challenging seasons that Dominic's path took an unexpected turn toward a moment of profound clarity. He and Bishop Diego had traveled to the town of Fanjeaux, a place deeply influenced by the heresy. The clergy there were discouraged, unsure how to reach their people. Debates between Catholics and Albigensians had been held publicly, but they often produced more hostility than understanding. Bishop Diego, observing the turmoil, called for a gathering of Catholic and Albigensian women, religious in the region. He believed that if their spiritual foundations could be strengthened, the entire community might experience healing. Dominic accompanied him, ready to support however he could. When the meetings began, Dominic listened attentively to the women's concerns. Many felt torn between charismatic Albigensian preachers and Catholic clergy, who seemed distant or poorly prepared for such challenges. What struck Dominic most was the longing he heard beneath their words, a longing for truth, for stability, for a spiritual life that nourished rather than condemned. After several days of discussion, Bishop Diego proposed that these women be gathered into communities where they could live in truth, supported by faithful teachers. Dominic felt a stirring within, recognizing that this work of forming communities rooted in authentic doctrine might one day become central to his own mission. As they left Fanjeaux, Dominic walked alone along a quiet stretch of road. The evening sky was streaked with gold, and a gentle breeze rustled the dry grass. He reflected on the conversations he had heard, on the women's yearning for guidance, on the people of Toulouse and the surrounding towns who had embraced dangerous teachings only because they sought a purity the Church had not adequately offered. He realized then that the preaching of truth must be supported by communities where truth could be lived. This insight struck him with surprising force. He felt the quiet whisper of grace urging him toward a deeper commitment. Not only must he preach, he must help build structures through which preaching could take root. That night, Dominic returned to prayer with renewed fervor. He knelt before the tabernacle and surrendered his desires completely, asking God to shape him into whatever instrument was needed. He asked for humility, not the humility that is merely polite, but the humility that empties the heart of all but God. He asked for perseverance to continue walking, even when the path grew long and uncertain. And above all, he asked for love, the kind of love capable of reaching souls trapped in darkness. As he prayed, something subtle but certain took shape within him, an inner assurance that his life must now be entirely given to the ministry of preaching. It was no longer enough to follow the bishop on occasional journeys. Dominic felt called to dedicate himself fully, permanently, with a single-hearted focus. He did not yet know how this mission would unfold, but the conviction was unmistakable. His purpose was to preach truth through a life fashioned after the apostles, poor, itinerant, prayerful, joyful, and unyielding in mercy. The next morning, he gently shared with the bishop the clarity he had received. Bishop Diego was silent for a long moment, watching the early sun illuminate Dominic's face. Then, with the wisdom of one who recognized God's work in human hearts, he nodded. "This path is not of your own choosing," he said softly. "It has been placed before you." Dominic bowed his head, humbled by the weight of the call and by the bishop's affirmation. For the time being, they continued their work together, but something in Dominic had shifted. His steps were lighter, his voice firmer, his prayer even more intense. He knew now that the mission entrusted to him was not temporary. It was the shape of his entire life. Yet in the midst of this newfound clarity, another quiet question rose within him, as soft as it was persistent. If this mission was to endure, how would God sustain it? What gift or grace would be given to guide him, to strengthen him, to reach not only minds but hearts? He did not yet know that the answer to this question would come in a vision so tender, so luminous, that it would shape not only his life but centuries of Christian prayer. From the quiet question rising in his heart, the road ahead began to take on a gentler, almost expectant light, as though heaven itself were preparing to answer the longing Dominic had carried since youth. He had given himself entirely to preaching, embracing poverty, prayer, and companionship with the people he served. Yet as he walked from village to village, speaking of God's mercy and the beauty of the Incarnation, he sensed that something more was needed, something not born of human wisdom, but of divine generosity. The heresy spreading across the land was not merely an intellectual error, but a wound of the heart, a deep confusion about the goodness of God and the dignity of creation. Dominic prayed fervently for guidance, asking God how truth could be carried, not only with clarity but with tenderness, in a way that would reach even the most wounded souls. During this time, Dominic traveled frequently between Fanjeaux and Prouilly, two towns lying on opposite slopes of a broad valley. Between them rose a rocky height known as the Prat del Cremats, a place where the winds carried both the scent of the fields and the echoes of distant voices. Dominic often climbed this hill to pray, for from its summit he could see the land stretched before him like an open book. Villages scattered across the countryside, small roads winding like threads, and countless homes where families struggled with questions of faith. Here, he would kneel on the dry earth, letting the vastness of the land remind him of the vastness of God's mercy. He prayed for the preachers who misled others, for the weary mothers searching for hope, for the children who grew up believing the world was a battleground of spirit against flesh. And in these moments of quiet pleading, he felt the nearness of heaven more intimately than ever before. It was on one such evening, when the sky was painted with shades of rose and gold, that a vision came to him, one that would ripple across centuries. Dominic had climbed the hill alone, seeking solace after a particularly disheartening day of dialogue with local leaders who remained unmoved by his explanations of Catholic teaching. He felt not discouraged, but sorrowful, sensing their longing but unable to pierce through the layers of misunderstanding. The world felt heavy, and Dominic, though strengthened by grace, carried that weight with earnest humility. As he knelt, he began to pray the way he always prayed, slowly, attentively, offering each breath as a gift to God. The breeze softened, the sounds of the village below faded, and a stillness settled around him like a mantle. It was then, in that stillness, that the light began to grow. At first, Dominic thought it was the sunset brightening unexpectedly, but the glow did not fade with the shifting of clouds or the coming of dusk. Instead, it gathered before him gently, like dawn warming the horizon. He lifted his eyes, and there, bathed in a radiance both earthly and heavenly, stood the Blessed Virgin Mary. She was surrounded by a serenity so profound that Dominic felt his heart open in awe and tenderness. Her presence carried no fear, only motherly compassion, as though she had been waiting to meet him in this very place, on this very evening. Her garments shone with soft light, the colors blending like the hues of the sky at dawn. Her eyes held a depth of love that made Dominic feel simultaneously small and profoundly cherished. In her hands she carried a wreath of roses, not mere flowers, but living symbols of prayer, each one glowing with grace. She approached Dominic with steps that seemed to glide over the earth, and her voice, when she spoke, was like music woven from peace itself. She told him that the confusion of the age required not only preaching, but a prayer that could reach the simplest hearts, a prayer accessible to the poor, the weary, the uneducated, and the sorrowful. She placed the wreath gently into his hands and explained that it represented a new way of prayer, the Rosary, a path through which the mysteries of Christ's life could be contemplated with childlike trust, a chain of prayers through which the faithful could meditate on the Incarnation, the Passion, and the glory of heaven, all while remaining anchored in humility and hope. Dominic held the wreath with trembling hands, sensing the weight of the gift. The Rosary was not merely a devotion, it was a doorway through which countless souls would encounter the love of Christ. Mary spoke of its power to soften hardened hearts, to heal confusion, to draw the faithful into the embrace of God. She explained that each rose symbolized a prayer offered with love, and that these prayers, when gathered together, formed a crown of devotion pleasing to heaven. Dominic listened with profound reverence, absorbing every word as though his soul were being inscribed with the mysteries of divine mercy. When the vision faded, the light softening into the gentle hues of twilight, he remained kneeling, still holding the memory of the Rosary in his hands, even if the physical wreath had vanished. He stayed on the hill long after darkness fell, contemplating the gift he had received. The stars emerged above him like small lanterns scattered across the sky, and he felt an immense peace settle over him. He understood now that the mission entrusted to him would not rest on preaching alone. It would be nourished by prayer deep, repetitive, simple, and powerful enough to reach every corner of the world. As he descended the hill, each step felt lighter, as though he carried not only the vision, but the gentle fire of the Virgin's love within him. The next days unfolded with quiet confirmation. Dominic introduced the Rosary to the communities he visited, teaching them how to pray through the mysteries of Christ's life, inviting them to meditate on the love of God made visible in the Incarnation. People responded with unexpected enthusiasm. The Rosary allowed them to pray with their hands as well as their hearts, to contemplate without requiring advanced learning, to enter the story of salvation through repetition that soothed the soul. Mothers prayed it while tending their homes. Shepherds prayed it as they watched their flocks. Children learned its rhythm as naturally as breathing, and Dominic saw with joy that the prayer Mary had given him was already healing wounds the Church had struggled to reach. Each time he prayed the Rosary, he felt renewed strength, as though Mary's gentle presence lingered beside him, guiding his words and softening his heart. The prayer became the thread that wove his days together, morning, noon, and night, each repetition a quiet offering of trust in God's providence. He spoke of it not with triumph, but with tenderness, explaining that it was a gift meant for all, especially the most forgotten and broken. Yet even as the Rosary took root in his ministry, Dominic sensed that this heavenly gift carried with it a deeper call, to form a community of preachers who would carry both truth and prayer into the world. He did not yet know when or how such a community would gather, but he felt its reality stirring faintly, like the first dawn light preparing to break through the horizon. And so the question that had once troubled him, how God would guide and sustain his mission, began to find its answer in the gentle glow of the Rosary. But another question emerged quietly, one that would soon shape the next stage of his journey. How would this simple gift spread beyond the valleys of southern France, reaching the wider world that hungered for light? From the gentle radiance of that heavenly gift, the Rosary began to take root in Dominic's life with a grace that felt both familiar and entirely new, as though the prayer had always been hidden in the folds of his soul, waiting for the Virgin to draw it into the open. Yet the vision on the hill was not a conclusion, but the beginning of a new rhythm, one that would shape his preaching, his encounters, and the fragile hearts of the people he served. It became clear to him, almost immediately, that this prayer was not a treasure meant to be held close, but a light meant to be shared widely. And so Dominic, with the simplicity that marked every step he took, began to weave the Rosary gently into the daily lives of those he met. In the early mornings, long before the sun rose over the tiled rooftops and fields, Dominic would begin by praying the Rosary alone. Often he walked while praying, his fingers tracing each bead as if touching the mysteries themselves. Each Our Father, a breath of surrender, each Hail Mary, a thread of trust, each meditation a window into the life of Christ. There was a quiet music to it, a cadence that wrapped itself around his heart like a warm cloak. The more he prayed, the more he felt his own soul soften, becoming more patient, more tender, more attuned to the needs of those around him. The Rosary did not pull him away from the world. It anchored him more deeply within it, teaching him to recognize God's presence in every face, every sorrow, every moment of hope. The people noticed this change quickly, even if they could not name it. When Dominic entered a village, there was a calmness about him that did not demand attention but invited trust. Mothers approached him first, their children clinging to their skirts, and asked him to bless their households. Elderly men, tired from years of toil, listened with unexpected attentiveness as he spoke of God's mercy with a gentleness that made their hardened eyes soften. Young people, searching for purpose in a world weighed down by fear, followed him with curiosity, sensing in him a kind of spiritual clarity that felt like fresh water after a long drought. Dominic shared the Rosary with them, not as a new devotion to memorize, but as a path of healing, a way to contemplate God's love when words felt insufficient. At first, he taught the prayer slowly, bead by bead, guiding their hands with patient care. Many had never prayed in a structured way. They knew the familiar prayers of the Church, but lacked a method that allowed them to dwell, to ponder, to linger with God in simplicity. The Rosary filled this need beautifully. It allowed even the humblest soul to meditate on the mysteries of Christ without requiring formal education or theological training. The shepherd could pray it on the hillside. The mother could pray it while kneeling beside her children's beds. The laborer could pray it as he walked from field to field. And Dominic saw the transformation this prayer brought to them, the way it quieted anxieties, softened divisions, and helped them carry the burdens of life with new strength. Dominic's preaching, already known for its clarity and gentleness, took on an even deeper warmth now that it was nourished by the Rosary. When he spoke of the Incarnation, it was as one who had held the mystery in his hands through prayer. When he spoke of Christ's passion, it was with a tenderness that made even the most hardened listeners feel the closeness of the suffering Savior. And when he spoke of the resurrection, his voice carried the light of one who had contemplated the empty tomb again and again in the stillness of dawn. The Rosary did not replace Scripture for him. It illuminated Scripture, threading the truths of the gospel into the daily rhythm of his ministry so seamlessly that one could scarcely tell where prayer ended and preaching began. As word of Dominic's preaching and the new devotion spread, entire villages found themselves drawn into its gentle light. In some places, families gathered each evening to pray together, creating small circles of flickering candlelight where voices rose softly into the quiet night. In other areas, groups of widows met to pray for the conversion of loved ones. Farmers began carving simple wooden beads to share with neighbors, and even those still entangled in the errors of the Albigensian movement found themselves moved by the prayer's simplicity and beauty. For some, the Rosary became their first step back toward the Church, a doorway through which grace could gently enter their hearts. One story that spread throughout the region spoke of a small village divided for years by disputes over land and inheritance. The tension had grown so bitter that neighbors no longer spoke to one another, and children learned to avoid entire sections of the town. When Dominic arrived, he sensed immediately that preaching alone could not heal such deep wounds. And so, instead of beginning with words, he invited the villagers to join him in praying the Rosary. At first, only a few came, mostly women, old men, and young mothers. But as the prayer filled the church with its quiet rhythm, something beautiful happened. People who had not spoken to one another in years knelt side by side, their voices uniting in the same gentle chorus. By the time they finished the final prayer, tears had begun to flow silently. And in the days that followed, old grudges began to unravel, softened not by argument, but by the grace of shared prayer. Stories like this spread, carried by travelers, merchants, and pilgrims. People began to speak not only of Dominic the preacher, but of Dominic the bearer of the Rosary. Dominic, whose prayer seemed to carry its own light, shining into places where division once dwelled. Some observers, both within and beyond the church, were curious about this new devotion. Others were skeptical, wondering whether such a simple prayer could carry real spiritual power. But Dominic simply continued, trusting not in himself, but in the gift he had been given. He knew that Mary would guide the hearts of those who prayed, just as she guided him. As Dominic's ministry expanded, he began to sense that the spread of the Rosary was not the end of the mission, but its foundation. Prayer alone could heal hearts, but the church needed preachers. Humble, learned, prayerful men who would walk the roads as he did, sharing truth with mercy and devotion. The fields were ready, the people hungry for guidance. The Rosary had softened them, prepared them, opened them. Now Dominic realized the next question was not whether the Rosary would take root, but how God would build upon this foundation to strengthen the church for generations to come. And so, beneath the beauty of the growing devotion, a deeper stirring began within him, quieter than a whisper, yet stronger than any earthly voice. If prayer was the first answer heaven had given him, what was the second? What new structure or community might rise from this tender beginning, shaped by truth, grounded in poverty, and carried by love? His heart waited for the answer, certain that God would reveal the next step in the same gentle way the Rosary had been given, through grace, through prayer, and through the quiet unfolding of providence. From the widening circles of prayer that the Rosary had begun to form around him, Dominic sensed that a new chapter of his mission was quietly gathering shape, one that would require not only his voice and compassion, but the collaboration of hearts prepared to walk beside him. The Rosary had brought healing, softened divisions, and stirred hope in places long weighed down by confusion. But there remained a question that now pressed more urgently within him. Who would continue this work when he moved on to the next town, the next valley, the next community in need? He had seen too clearly that the wounds of the age could not be mended by a single preacher, no matter how persistent or prayerful. If truth was to be restored, if charity was to flourish, if false teachings were to be gently untangled from the hearts of the faithful, then there must be others, men shaped by prayer, strengthened through study, and committed to poverty, who would join him in carrying Christ's light into the world. This realization grew slowly, like dawn brightening over a long horizon. Dominic did not rush it. He prayed with it, wrestled with it, carried it like a seed warming beneath the soil of his soul. The idea of forming a community of preachers brought both excitement and humility. He feared presumption. He feared stepping ahead of God's will. But the more he prayed, the more he recognized that this was not ambition, but obedience. Heaven had given him the Rosary, a gift that taught him the rhythm of contemplation and mission. Now he sensed heaven asking him to gather others who would live that rhythm with him. The landscape itself seemed to confirm this call. Fanzhou and its surrounding villages had become a kind of spiritual crossroads, one where truth and confusion collided daily. The conversations Dominic held with families, with merchants, with young men longing for purpose, all revealed the same hunger. People yearned for teachers who lived the gospel with authenticity. The clergy in many areas were overwhelmed, discouraged, or poorly trained. The Albigensian preachers, with their strict lives and tireless efforts, attracted attention not because their teachings were true, but because their example appeared compelling. Dominic realized that the church needed preachers who matched the sincerity of the heretics, yet surpassed them in charity, clarity, and joy, and the Holy Spirit seemed to whisper that this work could not wait. One evening, after a long day of walking and preaching in the countryside, Dominic returned to a small house in Fanzhou, where a few faithful women had begun gathering as a spiritual community. He often visited them to offer guidance and prayer, and they offered him, in return, a place of rest. As he approached the doorway, he heard the soft murmur of their voices praying the Rosary, the devotion he had shared with them only weeks before. Their words, rising gently into the twilight, filled him with a kind of peaceful certainty. These women, once torn by confusion, were now restoring their own hearts through prayer. They were forming a community where truth could be lived. It was a sign, small yet unmistakable, that the Church's renewal would come through communities shaped by the same simplicity and purity that Mary had entrusted to him. After they finished praying, Dominic sat with them by the glow of a single candle. They asked him questions about Scripture, about faith, about how to live with hope in troubled times. He answered patiently, drawing from the well of prayer that sustained him. When he rose to leave, one of the women asked quietly, "Master Dominic, will others come to help you? This work is too great for one man." The simplicity of the question pierced him, for it echoed precisely what he had felt forming within him for months. He smiled gently and promised that he was asking God for guidance. That night, Dominic walked alone through the fields, the stars stretching across the sky like beads on an unending chain. The fields rippled gently in the breeze, and with each step he felt the clarity of his calling deepen. He understood now that he must establish a community, a brotherhood of preachers who would walk in poverty, pray with fervor, study with devotion, and preach with the same compassion Christ had shown to the lost. A community whose strength would not rest on buildings or wealth, but on the witness of their lives. Bishop Diego, who had walked with Dominic through so many phases of this journey, became the first to support this inspiration. On a quiet morning, as they prepared to leave Fanjeaux for a brief journey, Dominic shared the stirring of his heart, that God seemed to be calling him to gather companions, to form a way of life rooted in apostolic simplicity. Diego, wise and attentive to the movements of grace, listened intently. When Dominic finished speaking, the bishop placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "Then let us walk in that direction. If the seed is from God, it will grow. If it is your own wish, God will purify it." Those words became another confirmation, a sign that the mission unfolding within him was not born of restlessness, but of grace. The following months were filled with small beginnings. Dominic met with young men drawn by his preaching, men who admired not only his words, but the authenticity of his life. At first, only a few, quiet, sincere, searching, joined him in prayer. They watched him rise before dawn to pray the Rosary. They observed his long conversations with villagers. They saw how he embraced poverty with joy, owning almost nothing, trusting entirely in God's providence. These young men began accompanying him on short journeys, listening to him preach, learning how to answer questions with patience rather than pride. Some found the life too demanding and turned away. Others discovered that the simplicity of Dominic's way awakened something in them that had long been dormant, a longing for a life entirely given to God. As their small group grew, Dominic emphasized 3 pillars: study, prayer, and preaching. Study was essential so that truth could be spoken with clarity. Prayer was the soul of preaching, the flame that warmed every word. Preaching was the fruit, the outward expression of a life rooted in God. Dominic told them that they must never preach what they did not pray, nor teach what they had not lived. His words did not carry the weight of rule or command. They carried the weight of love, the authority that arises when a man's life and his message are one. Though they lacked buildings, resources, or official recognition, the small community persevered. They traveled on foot. They begged for what they needed. They shared everything. And wherever they went, the Rosary became the rhythm of their days. Those who saw them walking along the dusty roads often mistook them for wandering hermits or scholars. But the people soon came to recognize them as something unique, preachers who lived as simply as the poor and spoke with a clarity that came from heaven. Over time, Dominic sensed that the community needed roots, a home where prayer and study could be nurtured, a place from which preaching missions could be sent forth. And so, he settled his growing group in Toulouse, a city that had once been deeply troubled by heresy, but was now becoming a fertile ground for renewal. Or there, in a simple house offered by a benefactor, the first formal gathering of what would become the Order of Preachers began to take shape. Dominic did not call it an order, he called it a way of life. But heaven already knew the truth. Something enduring had begun. The Rosary had softened the hearts of the people. Now the community would carry that light into the future. Yet Dominic, ever humble, knew the journey was not complete. Recognition from the wider church would be necessary. Guidance would be needed. The foundation was laid, but the structure had yet to be built. And so, as he prepared to take the next step, seeking the church's blessing for his fledgling community, he carried within him one question that would soon be answered in ways more beautiful than he could imagine. How would God breathe life into this small gathering so that it might one day embrace the whole world with truth and compassion? From the humble beginnings of that small community in Toulouse, Dominic felt the gentle unfolding of God's providence with a clarity that seemed to deepen with every passing day. The brothers who had gathered around him, some educated, others simple, all seeking truth, were only the first threads of a tapestry God was quietly weaving. Yet Dominic, faithful to the rhythm of grace rather than ambition, never rushed forward. He let each step emerge from prayer. The Rosary continued to structure his days, drawing his heart into the mysteries of Christ and shaping the way he guided his companions. But now, as the brothers prayed, studied, and traveled with him, Dominic saw something new taking root. A community becoming a living preaching of the gospel itself. Their unity, their poverty, their joy, their willingness to walk long distances under harsh conditions just to share the truth with one more village. These became sermons more eloquent than anything spoken from a pulpit. Life in Toulouse unfolded with a gentle simplicity. The house where they gathered was modest, its walls bare, its furnishings sparse, but it was filled with a warmth that came from the brothers' shared purpose. They rose before dawn to pray, their voices weaving through the psalms with the same peace that had once filled Dominic's solitary vigils. After prayer, they studied scripture, theology, the writings of the fathers, the questions of their age. Dominic insisted that every brother learn how to preach not only with clarity, but with compassion. He taught them that knowledge without charity could become harsh, but charity without truth could become empty. The brothers listened intently, drawn not only to his words, but to the way he lived them. Some days Dominic assigned them to visit nearby towns where confusion remained strong. He told them, "Preach always in humility. Walk gently. Let your life speak before your words." And so they went, carrying nothing but their cloaks, their books, and the rosary beads that had become like a heartbeat in the hands of every brother. They returned with stories of hearts opened, of families reconciled, of young men considering whether God might be calling them into this new way of life. The brothers also returned with weariness. Preaching on the road was not easy. They faced cold winds, rejected hospitality, long hours of walking, and the occasional hostility of those who mistrusted the church. But each time they returned home, their faces carried a quiet light. They felt part of something larger than themselves, something born from the gospel itself. Meanwhile, in Rome, the church grappled with the challenge of how to respond to widespread heresy. Councils debated, theologians wrote treatises, bishops convened meetings. Yet something was still missing, a living response, rooted not only in doctrine, but in authentic witness. When Bishop Diego passed away on a journey, Dominic felt both a deep sadness and an unexpected certainty. The bishop had been a mentor, a companion, and a fatherly guide. Now Dominic sensed that God was gently placing the next steps in his hands. It was time to seek official approval for the community God had begun to form through him. He prayed long before making this decision, kneeling with his face to the ground in the small chapel where the brothers gathered each morning. He asked not for success, but for purity of intention. He wished only to serve the church, not to advance his own ideas. When he finally left for Rome, he went alone, walking as he always did, trusting that God would provide. The journey was long, marked by cold nights and uncertain paths, yet Dominic felt accompanied by the quiet presence of Mary, whose rosary he prayed hour after hour as he walked. Arriving in Rome, he found the city buzzing with merchants, clerics, pilgrims, and debates. But Dominic was not shaken by the noise. He presented himself simply, explaining to the Holy Father the life he and his companions were living. When asked what rule they followed, Dominic replied that they followed the rule of Saint Augustine, enriched by practices that fostered study, prayer, and preaching. The Pope listened carefully, recognizing something deeply apostolic in the way Dominic spoke. Yet approval could not be granted immediately. The Church moved slowly, weighing decisions with care. Dominic remained in Rome for several months, spending his time in prayer and quiet conversation. He visited churches, prayed before relics, and sought counsel from wise clerics. Some encouraged him warmly. Others questioned whether poverty and itinerant preaching could sustain a lasting community. But Dominic, calm and grounded, never argued. He trusted that if God desired this mission, the approval would come in due time. And indeed, it did. Pope Honorius III eventually granted formal recognition to the group, naming them the Order of Preachers. Dominic received the news with humility, kneeling to thank God for allowing a dream he once carried alone to become a seed of hope for the Church. Returning to Toulouse with the papal blessing in hand, Dominic found the brothers waiting for him with eager hearts. They knew, even before he spoke, that something holy had begun. Dominic gathered them together in their chapel and told them that their simple house was now the cradle of a mission destined to reach countless souls. Yet he reminded them that the approval was not a crown, but a commission. "We are sent," he told them softly, "not to be honored, but to serve, not to shine, but to illumine." With this blessing, the community began to flourish. Dominic sent brothers to Paris, to Bologna, to Spain, cities where the intellectual life of Europe pulsed with debate. He knew that a preacher must stand in the heart of the world, not its margins. In Paris, the students of the university quickly noticed the Dominican brothers, men who studied deeply, prayed devoutly, and preached simply, without seeking reward. Their example inspired conversions, vocations, and renewed interest in the faith. In Bologna, the brothers opened another house, and it became a center of vibrant discussion, prayer, and study. Everywhere the brothers went, they brought with them the Rosary, the Gospel, and the living witness of lives shaped by humility. Through all this, Dominic remained the quiet center of the order. He traveled constantly, walking from house to house, checking on his brothers, encouraging them, praying with them. He refused honors, wealth, and comfort. He slept little, ate sparingly, and prayed unceasingly. Yet he radiated joy. His laughter was gentle, his presence peaceful, his compassion unwavering. He felt no need to cling to authority. He wanted only to form brothers who loved truth and lived it. Still, amid the growth and joy, Dominic carried one persistent question in his heart. Could the order sustain its spirit of humility and charity as it expanded into the great cities of Europe? How would these new houses filled with eager brothers guard the purity of the mission God had entrusted to them? That question, as tender as it was urgent, awaited its answer in the next season of his journey, one that would reveal both the beauty and the weight of building a community meant to preach Christ with every breath. From the gentle question that lingered in Dominic's heart, whether this growing community could remain humble as it expanded across the great cities of Europe, the next stretch of his journey unfolded with a grace that felt both delicate and deeply assured. The Order of Preachers was no longer merely a hopeful dream carried by one man. It had become a living body, breathing with prayer, nourished by study, and extending its hands toward the world with a missionary zeal that echoed the earliest days of the Church. Yet Dominic knew that growth alone was never the measure of God's will. What mattered was fidelity, fidelity to truth, to poverty, to the gospel lived in its purest simplicity. And so, as he traveled from region to region, visiting the houses of his newfound brothers, Dominic carried not only joy, but also a tender vigilance, always listening for the slightest signs of drift or weariness. His travels during this period were ceaseless. Dominic walked everywhere, rarely accepting the offer of a horse, preferring the humility and closeness to the poor that came from moving on foot. The roads he traveled wound through vineyards, olive groves, bustling towns, university quarters, and long stretches of countryside where only shepherds kept silent watch. He visited Paris, where the intellectual life of Europe surged through its universities like a powerful current. He visited Bologna, where mastery of law, rhetoric, and philosophy filled the streets with debate. He visited Spain, where he had grown up, bringing back to those familiar landscapes the fire of a mission that now stretched far beyond its origins. Everywhere he went, he listened before he spoke. He listened to his brothers as they shared their fears, their joys, their challenges as preachers. He listened to students in Paris who wrestled with questions of meaning. He listened to the poor who longed for a God who did not feel distant or harsh. And he listened, most especially, to the subtle movements of grace, recognizing that God often whispered the most important guidance through the simplest encounters. And grace did indeed move around him, sometimes quietly, sometimes in ways so unmistakable that the brothers spoke of them with reverence. Miracles began to follow Dominic, not because he sought them, but because charity tends to draw heaven's attention. In Paris, when the community's food supply dwindled, the brothers found their pantry suddenly filled with bread delivered by hands they never saw. In Rome, when a young man suffering from a grave illness asked Dominic to pray for him, his fever broke that very night, leaving physicians puzzled. In Bologna, a grieving mother brought her lifeless child to Dominic's feet, begging him through tears to pray. The brothers watched as Dominic took the child gently into his arms, his lips moving silently in prayer. Moments later, the child stirred, opened his eyes, and reached toward his mother, who collapsed into sobs of gratitude. These events spread quickly, carried by rumor and testimony, strengthening the faith of many who had grown weary. Yet Dominic himself always stepped back from the attention. When people praised him, he shook his head softly and said, "It is God's mercy, not my hands." When they tried to honor him, he redirected their gratitude toward the Blessed Virgin or toward the suffering Christ. He wanted no glory, no praise. His joy came only from seeing hearts restored, faith renewed, hope rekindled. If miracles occurred through him, it was only because God found a small, open channel in his humility. But miracles were not the only signs of Dominic's sanctity during this period. His brothers often marveled at his capacity for compassion. He seemed to carry the sorrows of others within himself, as though each burden entrusted to him became a quiet prayer rising in his heart. When a brother struggled with discouragement, Dominic stayed awake through the night, kneeling beside him in prayer until dawn brought new strength. When tensions arose within a community, he visited them personally, not with reprimands, but with gentle conversation and joyful example. He reminded them of their shared purpose, their vow of poverty, their responsibility to preach truth not for their own honor, but for the salvation of souls. He also showed an extraordinary capacity for joy. Despite long fasts, sleepless nights, and the exhausting demands of travel, Dominic carried a lightness that made even the most difficult days feel touched by grace. His laughter, soft, warm, and sincere, often lifted the spirits of entire communities. Brothers who felt overwhelmed by academic study or intimidated by preaching in great cities found in Dominic a reassurance that came not from words alone, but from the peace he carried within. He reminded them that their vocation was not a burden, but a gift, that the world was hungry for Christ's truth, and that their efforts, even when imperfect, were precious in the eyes of God. Yet as miracles and spiritual growth blossomed, Dominic remained deeply aware of the fragility of the mission. He warned his brothers gently against pride, reminding them that the moment they sought ambition or comfort, they would lose their effectiveness as preachers. He encouraged them to study tirelessly, not to appear learned, but to serve those who questioned with clarity and kindness. And he urged them always to pray the Rosary, insisting that no sermon, no mission, no journey could bear fruit unless it flowed first from contemplation. It was during this time that an event occurred which, though simple, revealed the depth of Dominic's holiness. In Bologna, while staying with the community, Dominic spent the night in prayer on the chapel floor. A brother passing by late in the evening noticed a strange glow emanating from the doorframe. Puzzled, he opened the door slightly and saw Dominic kneeling before the altar, his whole body surrounded by a soft radiance, as though the light of heaven itself had descended upon him. The brother closed the door quietly, trembling with awe. The next morning, Dominic greeted the community with the same quiet humility as always, never mentioning the vision he had experienced. But word reached the brothers, and they carried this memory as one more sign that God, who had chosen Dominic for this mission, continued to guide him intimately. As the order grew, Dominic also began to see that the brothers needed clear structure, something simple enough to foster freedom, yet strong enough to protect unity. He shaped their days around a balance of prayer, study, and preaching. He encouraged obedience not as a restriction, but as a path to harmony. He insisted that no brother possess personal wealth, and he reminded them always that their first duty was to preach Christ, crucified with gentleness, patience, and unwavering truth. Amid all this growth, Dominic never ceased walking. He walked to comfort brothers. He walked to preach in the streets. He walked to restore hope in communities still wounded by heresy. And as he walked, he prayed, not only for those he had met, but for those he would one day meet, those who would hear the gospel through future generations of preachers. Yet beneath the steady rhythm of his ministry, a quieter awareness settled into his heart. Though miracles were strengthening faith, and though the order was taking root in great cities, the brothers still needed his presence, and he wondered, with a tenderness that grew each day, how he could guide them not only through miracles, but through the simple witness of a holy life. How could he show them that preaching was more than eloquent words, that it was a way of being, a way of loving, a way of giving one's entire self for souls in need? That question, gentle yet pressing, would soon lead Dominic into the next phase of his mission, one where truth would shine not through extraordinary signs, but through the quiet fire of a life completely surrendered to God. From that tender question that had begun to rest more heavily in Dominic's heart, how he might guide his brothers not merely by miracles, but by the quiet, luminous witness of a life entirely surrendered to God, the next unfolding of his journey took on a tone both gentle and deeply interior. The order of preachers was growing, spreading into cities where minds hungered for knowledge and hearts for mercy. Yet Dominic understood with profound clarity that no structure, however blessed, could stand for long unless its foundation was built not only on truth, but on holiness. And so, with a care that seemed almost fatherly, he began to shape not only the outer form of the order, but the inner spirit that would sustain it through centuries. The brothers saw him not merely as their founder, but as a living example of the very gospel they preached. And Dominic himself, though unaware of how strongly his presence affected them, continued simply as he always had, praying, walking, fasting, encouraging, and offering his life for souls. During these years, Dominic spent long periods in Bologna, where the order had established one of its most vibrant houses. Bologna's streets were alive with students, scholars, jurists, and young men from every corner of Europe. It was a city of ideas, of public debates, of long discussions in candlelit rooms, and Dominic recognized that this environment, challenging though it was, could shape future preachers with exceptional wisdom. Yet he also saw how easily men could become lost in intellectual pride. And so, while encouraging his brothers to study with diligence, he reminded them constantly that the purpose of knowledge was not to dominate or impress, but to illuminate. Knowledge without charity, he often told them, breaks the one who holds it. But knowledge born of prayer becomes light for others. Dominic spent many nights praying silently in the chapel while his brothers slept. They did not know the extent of his vigils, for he hid them carefully, slipping into the church when the house grew quiet. There he would kneel before the tabernacle, his forehead touching the cool stone floor, offering prayers for each brother by name. He prayed for those who struggled with pride, for those overwhelmed by study, for those homesick, for those uncertain of their vocation, for those preparing to preach in difficult places. Sometimes he prayed for hours, tears slipping down his cheeks as he begged God to sanctify the order, to protect it from division, to make it a vessel of light in a world that often felt clouded by confusion. His compassion for his brothers expressed itself not only in prayer, but in small, hidden acts. When he saw a brother wearing shoes worn thin by travel, he exchanged them for his own without saying a word. When he heard of a brother falling ill, he visited him late at night, offering comfort and sitting at his bedside until morning. When a young novice grew discouraged with the demands of study, Dominic spoke with him gently, reminding him that God did not require brilliance, but sincerity. And when disputes arose between brothers, a natural occurrence in any community, Dominic resolved them not by exercising authority, but by encouraging mutual forgiveness and reminding them of their shared mission. One evening in Bologna, a heavy rain fell as the brothers finished their prayers. The wind rattled the shutters of the chapter house, and the streets outside ran with water. As the brothers prepared to retire, Dominic slipped quietly out into the storm. One of the brothers, concerned for his safety, followed him and watched as Dominic made his way toward the city's poorest quarter. There he found a group of beggars huddled beneath an archway, soaked and trembling. Dominic knelt beside them, removed his own cloak, and wrapped it around an elderly man who was shivering violently. He spoke softly to them, offering words of comfort that the brother watching from a distance could not hear. When Dominic finally returned to the convent, soaked to the bone yet smiling with a serene peace, the brother who had witnessed the scene realized that Dominic's greatest miracles were not the extraordinary wonders whispered about in the streets, but the quiet, hidden acts of charity that flowed naturally from his heart. Stories like this circulated quietly within the order, strengthening the brothers' resolve to imitate their founder, not out of admiration, but out of a shared desire for holiness. Dominic never instructed them to follow his example. He simply lived it. And in doing so, he revealed to them the deeper truth of their vocation, that preaching begins in the heart long before it begins on the lips. Yet even as he devoted himself to nurturing the spiritual health of his brothers, Dominic remained deeply committed to preaching. He continued to travel to villages where confusion still lingered, often slipping away from the city without announcing his departure. He moved with the same rhythm of prayer and compassion that had marked his earlier years. Some evenings he would return to Bologna exhausted, covered in dust, yet radiating joy, because he had helped one more soul return to God. He often preached in open fields or on street corners, drawing small crowds who listened not only to his words, but to the gentleness with which he spoke them. During these journeys, Dominic often experienced visions, quiet interior illuminations that strengthened his soul. One night, while praying alone, he envisioned the brothers of the order spread across the world like stars scattered across a night sky. Each star represented a preacher, shedding light into darkness. The sky was vast and filled with countless points of brilliance. Dominic understood that this was not a promise of glory, but of responsibility. Each star required the fuel of prayer and charity to burn brightly. The vision filled him with both hope and a renewed desire to ensure that the order would never lose its contemplative heart. Another time, as he walked through a forest path at dusk, Dominic felt a profound sense of Christ walking beside him, speaking without words, guiding him in silence. He returned from that walk deeply moved, sensing anew that the order belonged not to him, but to God. He was merely the caretaker, the shepherd entrusted for a brief time with something far greater than himself. Yet even as these graces deepened, Dominic became increasingly aware of his own bodily frailty. The years of fasting, walking, sleepless nights, and constant labor had gradually worn him down. Those who looked closely noticed that his face had grown thinner, his steps slower, his breath shallower after long journeys. But Dominic never spoke of his weariness. He continued serving until the very limits of his strength, offering his declining health as a final act of love. It was in this interior place, between the growing beauty of the order and the quiet weakening of his body, that a new question gently emerged. How could he ensure that the spirit of the order, rooted in humility, prayer, and compassion, would remain strong after he was gone? He pondered this, not with fear, but with a serene trust, and he would soon discover that God, who had guided every step of his life, had already prepared the next stage of the journey, a stage where the order would no longer lean on his presence, but on the legacy of love he had planted in their hearts. From the quiet, tender awareness that his strength was beginning to wane, Dominic found himself entering a new season of life, one shaded not by fear or regret, but by a deepening stillness that felt almost like a final grace. The order of preachers had taken root in ways he could never have orchestrated by his own efforts. Houses of study and prayer now rose in cities that shaped the intellectual life of Europe. Young men, once uncertain and searching, had become confident preachers whose words touched hearts with clarity and mercy. The Rosary, entrusted to him years earlier in a moment of heavenly tenderness, had become a gentle thread weaving through the daily rhythm of the communities he founded. And yet, beneath all these visible signs of growth, Dominic felt an interior shift, an awareness that the time had come to prepare the brothers to walk without him, guided not by his voice, but by the spirit of holiness that God had cultivated among them. He did not speak openly about this sense of approaching departure. Dominic never wished to draw attention to himself or to evoke sorrow in the hearts of those he loved. Instead, he embraced his responsibilities with renewed delicacy, as though each day might be his last opportunity to shape the order with a father's quiet love. He traveled more slowly now, but still traveled. He listened with even greater attention, prayed with even deeper surrender, encouraged his brothers with tenderness that touched them more profoundly because they sensed, though they could not explain it, that Dominic was giving them the last of his strength. When he returned to Bologna during this period, the brothers noticed a subtle difference in him. His face had grown thinner, his steps more measured, his periods of silent prayer longer, yet his joy remained untouched. If anything, it seemed brighter, as though he lived already half in the light of the world to come. At meals, he smiled often, listening more than speaking, savoring the simplicity of companionship. At night, though he could no longer endure the long vigils of his youth, he still slipped into the chapel, kneeling before the tabernacle with a childlike trust that seemed to sweep away all weariness. Those who happened to pass the chapel door felt the weight of his love in that silence, as though Dominic were laying the entire order into God's hands, relinquishing every anxiety, every hope, every burden. In this quieter time, he began to focus on strengthening the unity of the brothers. He knew that as the order expanded, it would endure trials, misunderstandings, cultural tensions, intellectual disputes, and the ordinary strains that test any community. And so he spoke often of humility, reminding the brothers that obedience to God and to the needs of others must remain the foundation of their life. He encouraged them to consult widely, to discern carefully, to trust deeply in one another's goodwill. He urged them to make decisions grounded in charity rather than personal preference. And he taught them, gently but persistently, that the light of the order would shine not through brilliance alone, but through the holiness of their relationships. One evening, as the brothers gathered for a simple meal, Dominic rose slightly from his seat and looked around the room with a quiet affection that softened every heart present. "My sons," he said softly, "love one another. Guard this love always. Let no shadow divide you, for unity is your strength. It is the first preaching you give to the world." His voice trembled slightly, not from emotion alone, but from the physical weakness that had begun to take hold of him. The brothers listened with an attentiveness beyond words. Even those who had known Dominic for only a brief time felt that something sacred was being entrusted to them. During this period, Dominic also spent long hours in council with the brothers, who held various responsibilities. He met with the teacher in Paris, encouraging him to form preachers who were both learned and humble. He met with the leader in Bologna, reminding him that authority is not a crown, but a service. He met with brothers preparing for distant missions, strengthening their hearts with the promise that God would be with them in every village, every encounter, every hardship. In these conversations, Dominic's words were simple, never dramatic, always marked by a peace that flowed from the depths of prayer. Yet amid this quiet labor of preparing the order for the future, Dominic's body continued to weaken. His long years of fasting, traveling, and sleepless nights had gently worn him down. The brothers encouraged him to rest, but he refused anything that felt like privilege. He continued walking from house to house, though now he paused more often, leaning briefly against a wall or a tree. He continued fasting, though he accepted small portions to maintain his strength. He continued praying deep into the night, though his body trembled with exhaustion. His joy never dimmed, but the signs were unmistakable. Dominic was nearing the end of his earthly journey. It was during one of his final journeys that the truth became clear, even to him. Traveling under the hot summer sun, Dominic felt his strength give way. His steps slowed, his breathing became labored, and the brothers accompanying him grew deeply concerned. They urged him to ride a mule, and though he disliked such comforts, he agreed out of obedience to their care. When they reached Bologna, Dominic could no longer hide his weariness. The brothers, seeing his frail condition, arranged a bed for him, but Dominic refused to die on a mattress, saying with gentle firmness, "Let me die on the ground, for that is the way of a preacher of the gospel." And so they laid him on a simple bed of straw, in a quiet room warmed by the afternoon light. The brothers gathered around him, not with panic, but with the reverent sorrow of sons who knew they were accompanying a holy father to the threshold of eternal life. Dominic spoke softly to them, urging them once more to live in charity, to persevere in poverty, to love prayer, and to preach truth with gentleness. He blessed them individually, calling each by name. His eyes shone with love, pure, peaceful, unwavering. As the moment of his passing drew near, Dominic whispered a final prayer. "Lord, I have labored for you, as you asked. Receive my soul and watch over my brothers." The rosary, resting in his weakened hands, seemed to glow faintly in the quiet light of the room. His breathing slowed, then softened, then ceased. A profound stillness filled the room, the kind that feels less like silence and more like a veil of grace descending. The brothers fell to their knees, tears slipping down their faces, yet mingled with a strange peace. They felt not abandonment, but a sense that Dominic had simply stepped into the light he had followed all his life. In that stillness, a new question rose, not in fear, but in wonder. How would the order of preachers carry forward the spirit of this man who had taught them to live, to love, and to preach with such unity of heart? It was a question that God would soon answer through the legacy Dominic left behind, a legacy written not only in words or miracles, but in the simple, luminous holiness that had shaped every breath of his life. From the stillness that followed Dominic's passing, a gentle and almost fragile silence settled over the community, as though heaven itself had paused, allowing the brothers to absorb the weight and grace of what had just occurred. They had accompanied him to the very threshold of eternity, witnessing a death marked not by fear or resistance, but by a serene surrender that reflected the entire pattern of his life. And now, with the quiet of that sacred moment still lingering in the air, the brothers found themselves entering a new era, one filled with sorrow, yes, but also with a deep and unexpected strength. For although Dominic had gone to the Lord he had served so completely, something of him remained palpably among them, as if every prayer he had whispered, every act of charity he had performed, every mile he had walked in poverty had left behind a gentle but indelible fire. In the days that followed, the brothers moved through the convent with a kind of reverent attentiveness. They spoke softly, not out of forced solemnity, but because a holy presence seemed to hover in every hallway. Some spent long hours in the chapel, kneeling where Dominic had often prayed through the night. Others lingered in the refectory, remembering the way he had smiled at them during meals or listened gently to their concerns. In the cloister, novices walked with bowed heads, reminded that the founder whose words had shaped their vocation was now interceding for them from heaven. The community felt both smaller because the one who had guided them was gone, and larger because Dominic's spirit seemed to expand mysteriously within their midst. His burial took place with simple dignity. News of his death spread quickly through the city of Bologna, and people from every walk of life came to pay their respects. Students from the university who had listened to Dominic's sermons in marketplaces and lecture halls wept openly. Poor families whom he had quietly helped with food or clothing carried flowers to his resting place. Even those who had never spoken with him directly came, drawn by the quiet witness of his charity. Some had heard stories of miracles. Others had simply sensed the holiness that emanated from him. In their eyes, Dominic was not merely the founder of an order, but a friend, a father, and a shepherd whose love had touched them without fanfare. As the brothers stood by his grave, they prayed the Rosary in slow, steady tones, letting each mystery carry them deeper into the life of Christ, the life Dominic had mirrored so faithfully. The beads slipped through their fingers like small drops of consolation, reminding them that the prayer Dominic had received from the Virgin Mary was now their inheritance. Many felt, as they prayed, that Dominic himself was praying beside them, guiding their hearts even from beyond the veil. In the weeks that followed, the question that had hovered gently in the brothers' hearts, how the order would continue without him, began to find its answer. The unity Dominic had nurtured so carefully did not waver. If anything, it grew stronger. The brothers felt a shared responsibility, a bond deepened by grief but strengthened by love. They knew that Dominic's greatest desire had been for them to live in charity, humility, and truth. And so, as if responding to an unspoken instruction, they embraced their duties with renewed devotion. The teachers continued their lectures. The preachers set out on foot once more. The novices studied with fresh resolve. The daily rhythm of prayer flowed on, carrying the light that Dominic had kindled. What surprised them most was how often Dominic's presence seemed to accompany them. When a brother felt discouraged in his studies, he remembered Dominic's gentle words, "Study not for your glory, but for the souls who long to know God." When another hesitated before a preaching mission, he recalled how Dominic had walked miles through storms simply to reach a single village. When tensions arose, as they inevitably did in any human community, the brothers invoked Dominic's call to unity, and the memory of his humility softened their hearts. It became clear that the spirit he had formed within them was not fragile, but resilient, not dependent on his physical presence, but rooted in the very heart of their vocation. During this period, many brothers experienced consolations that felt like Dominic's quiet intercessions. In Paris, a young preacher, overwhelmed by the brilliance of the university scholars, felt a sudden peace as he stepped into the pulpit, speaking with clarity that surprised even himself. In Rome, a brother praying late at night sensed Dominic's presence near the altar, reassuring him in a moment of doubt. In Bologna, several brothers reported dreams in which Dominic appeared, offering words of encouragement, always pointing them back to Christ. These experiences, though not proclaimed widely, sustained the brothers with a deep consolation. It was as though heaven had permitted Dominic to remain close, guiding the order he had founded with the same tender vigilance he had shown during his earthly life. The expansion of the order did not slow after his death. Instead, it accelerated, as though the Holy Spirit wished to confirm the divine origin of Dominic's mission. Houses multiplied. Young men, inspired by the brothers' preaching, sought to join this new way of life. Universities welcomed the order enthusiastically, recognizing the purity of its intellectual purpose. Bishops sought their counsel. Cities requested their presence. And everywhere they went, the brothers carried Dominic's three treasures: study, prayer, and preaching. These pillars, simple yet profound, became the backbone of the order, shaping its identity across generations. Perhaps most remarkable was the way the Rosary spread. What had begun as a quiet gift given to Dominic on a hillside in southern France now blossomed across Europe. Families prayed it, soldiers carried it, merchants kept it in their satchels, widows whispered it in dimly lit rooms, children learned it before they could read, and through this prayer, countless hearts found peace, clarity, and protection. The mysteries of Christ, his birth, his suffering, his glory, became woven into the everyday life of the faithful. The Rosary became a chain of grace stretching across countries and centuries, a living legacy of the vision Mary had entrusted to Dominic. As the years passed, the brothers gathered often to remember their founder, not with idealized admiration, but with the warm affection of those who had truly known him. They recalled his barefoot journeys, his laughter, his tears, his sleepless nights, his devotion to the poor. They remembered how he prayed, how he fasted, how he encouraged them with fatherly tenderness. Each memory was like a small flame, illuminating the path forward. And in this remembering, they discovered a beautiful truth. Dominic's life was not an isolated example of holiness. It was a seed planted in each of them, a seed already bearing fruit in their missions, their preaching, their unity. In time, people began to speak of miracles at Dominic's tomb. The sick were healed, the troubled found peace, and travelers who prayed there felt strengthened in their journeys. These signs, however extraordinary, seemed entirely consistent with the charity that had marked Dominic's life. The brothers received such reports with humility, recognizing them not as proof of Dominic's greatness, but as expressions of God's love working through him. And so the order flourished, not because Dominic had built a perfect structure, but because he had built a family shaped by truth and bound together by a love that did not diminish with death. A family that understood more deeply now than ever that holiness is not a solitary achievement, but a legacy passed from heart to heart. Yet even amid this growth, one question remained. How would future generations remember Dominic? Would they see him only as a founder, or would they recognize the deeper grace that had shaped his life? That question, tender and timeless, unfolded into the final chapter of his story, where the Church herself, led by the Holy Spirit, would affirm the sanctity of his life and honor the legacy he had left for centuries to come. From that tender question, how future generations would remember the man whose holiness had quietly shaped a new dawn for the Church, the final chapter of Dominic's story began to unfold not through his own actions, for his earthly journey had already reached its peaceful end, but through the living witness of those who carried his spirit within them. The years after his death revealed something extraordinary. Dominic's legacy was not merely preserved, it flourished with a vitality that could only be explained by the breath of the Holy Spirit. The order of preachers continued to blossom. The Rosary spread gently through the lives of ordinary families, and stories of Dominic's charity, humility, and miracles circulated far beyond the places where he had walked. His memory did not fade. Instead, it grew more luminous, as though heaven were slowly unveiling the depth of the gift he had been to the world. In the early years following his passing, the brothers often gathered to share memories of their founder, not out of nostalgia, but out of a desire to understand the holiness they had witnessed. They remembered his tenderness toward the poor, his unwavering commitment to truth, the way he knelt in prayer with tears sliding down his cheeks, the childlike purity that radiated from him even in moments of exhaustion. These recollections became a kind of silent instruction for the brothers, forming the heart of the order's tradition. In their conversations, they did not speak of Dominic as a distant figure or an unapproachable model. They spoke of him as a father, a companion, a luminous presence whose memory continued to inspire their daily lives. One brother, who had often traveled with Dominic through the villages of southern France, recalled a moment when Dominic paused at the edge of a field at sunset. The sky was painted with warm, fading colors, and the air was still. Dominic stood quietly, his eyes fixed on the horizon, and after a long silence he said, "The beauty of creation is a gentle sermon of God's love. See how even the setting sun preaches with tenderness." Those who heard the story later understood that Dominic had seen the world not with the eyes of a scholar alone, but with the heart of a contemplative whose every breath was rooted in prayer. Another brother remembered how Dominic often returned from long journeys barefoot, his feet cut and bruised from miles of travel, yet his face shining with joy because he had preached the gospel to one more soul. The brothers who tended to his wounds would gently scold him, urging him to take better care of himself. Dominic would smile softly and say, "If I have planted even one seed of truth today, the pain is nothing." These memories became treasured stories, woven into the community's shared identity, shaping how future generations understood the meaning of apostolic poverty. As the years passed, devotion to Dominic grew naturally among the faithful. People visited his tomb in Bologna, seeking comfort and healing. Mothers brought their children, asking for Dominic's intercession in times of illness. Scholars knelt in silence, asking for clarity in their studies. Travelers stopped to pray before continuing their journeys. And again, graces seemed to flow from that quiet, resting place. Some left healed, others left strengthened, all left with a sense of peace that defied explanation. The brothers recorded these events with humility, careful not to exaggerate, but also mindful of the genuine works of God taking place through Dominic's intercession. The Church took notice. Reports of miracles, testimonies of prayers answered, and accounts of conversions attributed to Dominic's intercession reached bishops, theologians, and eventually the Holy Father. The order itself bore witness to the enduring power of Dominic's vision. Houses continued to form in major cities. Scholars admired the clarity and depth of Dominican teaching. Preachers of extraordinary courage emerged from the order, carrying Dominic's spirit into new lands and new challenges. The Rosary, once a quiet gift entrusted to a single man, now spread across Europe like a gentle fire of devotion. In village homes, monasteries, cities, farms, and even courts, the Rosary became a lifeline for souls seeking comfort, guidance, and peace. In this atmosphere of growth, Reverence for Dominic's memory deepened into something more. The brothers began to realize that the holiness they had witnessed in him was not merely personal goodness, but true sanctity, an extraordinary union with God that deserved recognition by the Church. And so, with humility and reverence, they began the process of sharing these testimonies, miracles, and memories with the wider Church. Not to glorify Dominic, for he would have rejected any personal honor, but to acknowledge the grace God had poured into the world through him. The Church, discerning carefully and prayerfully, came to the same conclusion. The evidence of Dominic's sanctity was overwhelming. His purity of intention, his life of prayer, his apostolic zeal, his miracles, his enduring influence on the Church, and the countless graces obtained through his intercession. And so, years after his death, the Church canonized him, declaring publicly what the brothers and the faithful had long known in their hearts. Dominic was a saint. His feast day was assigned, his relics honored, his story cherished as part of the treasury of the Church. News of his canonization brought joy not only to the brothers of the Order of Preachers, but to the faithful across Europe. In villages where Dominic had once preached, bells rang in celebration. In cities where the order had flourished, processions filled the streets. Families prayed the Rosary with renewed devotion, grateful for the saint who had brought this heavenly gift into their lives. And in Bologna, at the tomb where Dominic rested, pilgrims arrived in greater numbers than ever, leaving behind small tokens of gratitude, candles, flowers, handwritten prayers, and whispered petitions. Over time, the image of Dominic took on a familiar form in Christian art. A man clothed in the black and white habit of his order, holding a lily symbolizing purity, a star shining above his forehead, and a book or a rosary in his hand. The star, often depicted as radiant, recalled the light of grace that seemed to follow him wherever he went. Some said that at his baptism, a star appeared on his forehead. Others believed it represented the luminous truth he preached. Either way, the symbol captured beautifully the essence of Dominic, a man who carried the light of Christ into dark places with courage, clarity, and love. The Order of Preachers continued to flourish long after his canonization. Great saints emerged from its ranks, men and women who carried forward Dominic's mission with profound fidelity. St. Thomas Aquinas gave the Church a monumental theological vision grounded in truth and humility. St. Catherine of Siena, through her writings and counsel, guided popes and renewed the spiritual life of Europe. Countless others, both known and hidden, preached, wrote, studied, prayed, and lived out the Dominican motto, to contemplate and to give to others the fruits of contemplation. Each one carried Dominic's spirit, his love of truth, his devotion to the Virgin Mary, and his tender compassion for souls. Through these generations, Dominic's legacy evolved from personal memory into an enduring spiritual inheritance. People did not merely remember him, they walked in the path he had forged. They prayed the Rosary with the same trust he had learned from Mary. They preached truth with the same clarity he had embraced. They lived in community with the same charity he had nurtured. And they loved with the same simplicity he had modeled. As centuries passed, the world changed. Empires rose and fell, new cultures emerged, and the Church faced new challenges. Yet the light Dominic had kindled never dimmed. His order continued to proclaim truth in every generation, adapting to new times while remaining rooted in the gospel. The Rosary continued to sustain the faithful in moments of sorrow and joy alike. And Dominic himself remained a quiet, steadfast presence, one whose story, though rooted in the past, continued to inspire countless hearts seeking truth, mercy, and heavenly light. And so the journey of Dominic's life, born in northern Spain, shaped by compassion, guided by heavenly visions, and crowned with a life of holy preaching, now rested in the arms of the Church he loved. His memory lived on not as a monument but as a mission, not as a relic of history but as a living flame, not as a distant example but as a companion for every soul longing to walk with God. Thus ends the sacred story of Saint Dominic, the saint of visions, miracles, and heavenly truth. And yet, as with all true saints, his ending is not truly an ending at all. For his light continues to shine wherever the Rosary is prayed, wherever truth is spoken with love, wherever charity heals wounds, and wherever simple hearts surrender themselves to God.